Welcome back. Here we are, taking a look at part 2 of the respiratory system, chapter 22. Let's get this out of the way. Let's jump back into our PowerPoint right where we left off. Or actually, maybe a slide back from where we left off. We've got the pulmonary ventilation down. We talked about all the structures of the upper respiratory system and the conducting zone of the lower respiratory system. We also talked about the actual respiratory zone or ventilation zone of the lower respiratory system. When we talked about the alveoli and where the actual gas exchange happens, where external respiration happens. And now we're going to talk about the physics of what allows pulmonary ventilation to happen physically in our lungs, and the physics of how external respiration, how gas exchange physically happens inside of the alveoli, or between the alveoli and the capillaries surrounding the alveoli. Internal respiration has a lot of the same physics as external respiration, and that's really here. And then cellular respiration is the fun stuff that we already talked about back in part A and in bio 1. Happens actually within the cells, inside of the mitochondria of the cells, so we're not super worried about that today. Not today. All right, so the first thing we have to talk about here is the pressure, the different pressure relationships inside of your thorax that allow breathing to happen. The first one we need to understand is atmospheric pressure. Okay, so atmospheric pressure is literally the pressure that the air or the atmosphere around your body has as it's pressing on your body and into your body. We have to have a certain atmospheric pressure. We evolved to survive in Earth's atmospheric pressure. And without it, our lungs would collapse. That's why you cannot breathe in space. Space is a vacuum. There is no pressure to push the non-existent atmosphere into your lungs. Down on Earth, in our nice atmosphere, it pushes down on us and it actually helps to push air into our lungs. Pretty weird. Technically, so at sea level, that's 760 millimeters of mercury. That's the pressure at sea level. If you go up to the top of a mountain, that pressure, the atmospheric pressure is a little bit lower, but still enough to do what it needs to do. And for some people, it's not quite enough to do what it needs to do, and you end up feeling sick. Like elevation sickness is just because that pressure isn't enough to get you enough oxygen. You feel a little nauseous and headache and stuff like that. Usually not dangerous. At the top of the highest mountains, it is very dangerous, but any place that most of us will probably visit is fine. Below sea level, that pressure gets larger and larger, right? So if you go underwater, under the ocean, that pressure gets larger and larger and larger, and then you also cannot breathe. Obviously, you can't breathe underwater for other reasons, but even if you did have pressure like that, you would not be able to exhale, right? All right, the second type of pressure that we need to understand, besides atmospheric pressure, is intrapulmonary pressure, and that is the pressure inside of your lungs, okay? So this pressure varies according to where you are in your breathing cycle. The interpulmonary pressure, which is the actual pressure inside of the alveoli, right, inside of your lungs, gets higher when you inhale. You increase the pressure inside of your lungs, and it gets lower as you exhale and decrease the pressure inside of your lungs, okay? So the intrapulmonary pressure is the pressure inside of your lungs, which is here. And this pressure will always try to equalize with the atmospheric pressure, right? Because if you kind of relaxed and weren't trying to breathe or anything, there will be a certain amount of air in your lungs. If you exhale all the way and tried to just relax with your airways open, you would be holding your lungs small with your muscles, but it takes effort to do that. If you actually relaxed, air would come in. on its own, thanks to atmospheric pressure, and thanks to the fact that atmospheric and interpulmonary pressure wants to equalize if it's left to do that. It's just an open system, open to the atmosphere, so they should be the same because they're open to each other. All right, the third one is going to be your intrapleural pressure. And this is going back into what I was talking about, why that the fluid inside of the intrapleural cavity is so, so important. The intrapleural pressure, which is the pressure in the space in between the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura, that little sliver of pleural cavity that your lungs don't take up, the pressure in there needs to be negative relative to your intrapulmonary pressure. It needs to be a relative vacuum. It needs to be, we need to have a pressure that is sucking these two surfaces towards each other. They need to be sucking towards each other, because when you inhale and you pull the walls of your thoracic cage apart, your lungs need to stick to those walls and come with it so that air can be pulled in from the atmosphere into the intrapleural space, into the inside of the lungs, the inside of the alveoli of the lungs. Okay, so as long as the intrapleural pressure is negative, then it's creating a vacuum that sucks the wall of the lung to the wall of the thorax, so that when you inhale, the walls of the lungs also expand. They get pulled out with the wall of the thorax. Okay. We call the difference between that pulmonary pressure and the interpleural pressure, the transpulmonary pressure. Okay, so the transpulmonary pressure is what we call the pressure in between the pulmonary pressure and the intrapleural pressure, which needs to exist. That difference needs to be a thing. The interpulmonary pressure inside of the lungs should be positive relative to the intrapleural pressure. The intrapleural pressure needs to be negative relative to the interpulmonary pressure. Okay, there needs to be a vacuum, a relative vacuum in the pleural cavity. If these two pressures equalize, the lungs will collapse. The only way that these two pressures can equalize is if there is a breach through the wall of the lung. Okay, so that a hole in the wall of the lung would cause the pressure between the interpleural cavity and the inside of the lung to equalize, right? Just like a spaceship out in space, if you open up a hatch, all the air will rush out and the two will equalize, and you'll basically have space vacuum inside of your spaceship, right? We've seen it in all the great space thrillers that there are out there. So the way that this happens is with a puncture wound. If you puncture a lung with your rib, or you get stabbed, which is what they chose for this example for some reason, or if your lung spontaneously breaks open. I don't want to say burst because that sounds really terrifying, but it's true. If you burst your lung, or if you somehow otherwise get a hole in your lung in between the pleural cavity and the inside of the lung, those two places will equalize and the lung will collapse. Okay, so in this image, we're showing an injury to the right lung, causing equalization of the pressure from a 0 inside of the lung, intrapulmonary, and -4 intrapleural, to equalized 0 in both the intrapleural and in the interpulmonary space. That lung collapses, and it cannot reinflate until that hole is repaired. It needs to be fixed there. And it's even more complicated than that because this space will fill with fluid, right? Okay, so very, very important. Inspiration is not just caused by the atmospheric pressure. Okay, so I already said that atmospheric pressure will push air into your lungs. We also need to pull in more air than just that. So that equalized atmospheric interpulmonary pressure isn't quite enough to get the oxygen that we need for our tissues. So we need to inhale and exhale, or inspire and expire. Inspiration is inhalation and expiration is exhalation. I'm not sure why we need all these different words, but that's fine. Inspiration is inhalation, we are inhaling, and we do this with our various muscles, thoracic muscles. The diaphragm is the main one that you think of when you're inhaling. The diaphragm sits up like an upside down U, and it's attached to the base of your lungs, right? So the base of your lungs are sitting on top of the diaphragm, which is like this. When the diaphragm contracts, it actually pulls down and becomes flat, which means that the bases of the lungs are also getting pulled down and becoming flat. That increases the size of the lungs. Let's see if we can get a little bit of a view or an idea of how that happens. Actually, do I not have, there we go. So check out the diaphragm. This isn't the best, but the diaphragm is kind of going from being like way up here and it's kind of flattening a little bit. When it does that, it's pulling the base, the bottoms of the lungs down with it because of that intrapleural pressure difference, right? So that negative intrapleural pressure, so the space in between the parietal pleura, that membrane that's between the diaphragm and the lung, the visceral pleura of the lung, that pressure, that vacuum in that intrapleural or that pleural cavity is going to allow the bottoms of the lungs to be sucked down with the diaphragm as it contracts. So the diaphragm contracts and pulls the bottoms of the lungs down with it, which increases the space inside of the lungs, which also has the effect of decreasing the pressure inside of the lungs. You might think of pressures and partial pressures of gases as kind of like diffusion. A gas will move down its pressure gradient, okay? So where there is a place of high pressure and a place of low pressure, if they get connected, the high pressure will move into the low pressure space. So if you are pulling your lungs open, you're decreasing the pressure inside of the lungs, which means that the atmospheric pressure is now greater than the pressure inside of the lungs, that intrapulmonary pressure. So it basically is creating a vacuum and sucking that air down into the lungs. But on a physics level, it's literally the higher pressure, the higher atmospheric pressure is making the gas move from the high pressure environment down into the low pressure environment. But that's basically what it means to create a vacuum. Like literally your vacuum cleaner is causing air from outside of the vacuum, which is a higher pressure, to move into the lower pressure environment maintained by the mechanism of the vacuum. That sucking is creating a low pressure vacuum. That's what it's doing. And your lungs, your diaphragm is doing the same thing. In addition to your diaphragm doing that, contracting and pulling the bottoms of the lungs down, your extra or external costal muscles, remember, so the intercostal muscles in between all of your ribs, which we learned about in part A, we're finally learning what they do now. They are in charge, they're not in charge, but they are an important part of inhalation. When they contract, when the external intercostal muscles contract, they pull the ribs up and out. And that expands your entire thoracic cavity, pulls the walls of the thoracic cavity up and out, which, thanks to that pleural, that interpleural pressure, is going to also pull the walls of the lungs along with it. So it's sucking the lung walls out with the walls of the thorax, and that is increasing the area inside of the lungs, which decreases the pressure of the gases in the lungs, which causes the atmosphere to flow down its pressure gradient down into the lungs because you're creating a vacuum. Okay, so the lungs then get stretched by the combination of the diaphragm contracting and your external intercostal muscles pulling your ribs up and out, kind of like the handles on a bucket. They kind of get pulled. This is the ribs and this is your sternum here. They get pulled from this position up to this position. that. And air flows into the lungs. Here's another picture, same words over here, showing the diaphragm from being that upside down U to a flattened position, and the external intercostals being relaxed and then contracting and pulling the ribs up and out for inspiration. Okay. Expiration, which equals exhalation, is when your diaphragm relaxes. Okay, your diaphragm relaxes, returns to its nice upside down U shape. The lungs are going to get a little bit smaller because the bottoms are being pushed up a little bit. And if you exhale forcefully, you are also using your internal intercostal muscles to pull the ribs back down, okay? So nice, relaxed, resting inhalation and exhalation mostly just uses your diaphragm. You're mostly doing, if you're working a little bit harder than that, then you're using your external intercostals and your internal your external intercostals and your internal intercostals to expand the thoracic cage and pull the thoracic cage closed. So you got that as well going on. It's the external, which is opening the thoracic cage, and the internal, when they contract, they pull the ribs together. And in addition, you also have a little bit of the rectus abdominis helping with this as well. So when the rectus abdominis contracts, you can also push out a little bit of extra air when you're like kind of sucking in your belly, right? If you do belly breathing exercises or like breathing meditation or any kind of breathing exercises, a lot of times you're asked to focus on the movement of the belly. And it's really good for you to do some belly breathing every once in a while when you think of it, because it's good for your digestive organs. It's good for your lymphatic system. It's pushing your lymph around. It's pushing your venous deoxygenated blood up to your heart. And it's also helping with the breathing as well. So when you contract your external or your rectus abdominis muscles, you're also kind of like making your abdomen concave and helping to push the lungs up. And gases flow out of the lungs, okay? Here's this same analogous image for expiration, for exhalation. The diaphragm relaxes, it pushes the bottoms of the lungs up, the rib cage gets pulled in, and that also squeezes the lungs. As you make the lungs smaller, you force them smaller, you increase the pressure of the gases that are inside, right? Because you have a container and you squish it, you increase the pressure of it inside like a balloon, right? And so when you're pressing it and increasing the pressure inside of the lungs, that interpulmonary pressure exceeds the atmospheric pressure, and therefore that gas will flow down its pressure gradient away from the lungs and out into the atmosphere. Okay, physics. This is why physics is actually important. Okay, and chemistry. We're learning about molecule energy, right? So molecules, gas molecules, they're all bouncing off of each other in a gas. If they get into a smaller enclosed space, they bounce off of each other more, and that's kind of why, that's what we call pressure, and that's why they are going to be moving out and away from that high pressure environment to a lower pressure environment. It all makes sense once you understand it. Okay, so we have the thoracic pressures down: atmospheric pressure, interpulmonary pressure, and that interpleural pressure in that interpleural cavity or that pleural cavity. And then the transpulmonary pressure, which is the difference between the pressure, that interpulmonary pressure in the lungs and that pleural cavity pressure. We need to maintain that difference, otherwise the lungs collapse. Now let's talk about the different respiratory volumes. This is more of a clinical application discussion now. These are the types of things that we measure to measure pulmonary efficacy, right? So your tidal volume is just the amount of air that you breathe in and out during normal, relaxed, calm breathing. For like most adult Humans, it's around 500 milliliters of gas, of air, okay? Just relaxed, right? So this is your tidal volume during nice relaxed breathing. So this light blue line here, that is relaxed breathing. That's tidal volume. Inspiratory reserve volume is the amount of air that you can inhale forcefully beyond the normal tidal volumes. This is what you normally inhale, but if you inspire forcefully, that's how much that you can actually inhale on top of that. Okay, so that is actually here. The inspiratory reserve volume is between here and here, above and beyond how much you inhale normally when you're calmly breathing normally. The expiratory reserve volume is the opposite, right? So beyond what you normally exhale, how much you can exhale beyond that, okay? So that is this darker blue tealish color down here. All right, and the residual volume is how much that remains in the lung no matter how hard you try to exhale. So no matter how hard you exhale, there will always be a little bit of residual volume left over in the lung, okay? And that is this green amount right here. Even after you exhale the most that you possibly can, there will still be residual volume left over, okay? So the volume is just the amount, okay? The capacity is like the maximum amount, the max volume, okay? So the capacity you can also think of as max volume. The capacity. The ability, your maximum ability, okay? The total lung capacity is the amount of air, the maximum amount of air that you can squeeze into your lungs with the maximum inspiratory effort. Oh, that's the capacity, that's the max, the upper limit. And this is per individual, right? So your total lung capacity is different from somebody else's total lung capacity and depends on your size, the size of your lungs, and the condition of your lungs, right? Your lung capacity can be improved with practice and it can be diminished with injury or disease, right? Your vital capacity is the maximum amount of air that you can exhale out of the lungs. The max that you can exhale. The maximum to where the residual volume is all that's left, okay? So the maximum for you, how much can you exhale max? The vital capacity is measured with a spirometer, which we'll talk about in a second, but when you blow into that device to measure your lung of efficacy, your pulmonary health, you're exhaling as fast as you can, as hard as you can into a tube so that a machine can measure how much air, how much your vital capacity is, what that volume is. Your vital capacity is basically your expiratory reserve volume, right? All right. Inspiratory capacity, we just talked about that. Functional residual capacity is the normal residual volume for a person after a normal inhalation. So it's basically your personal residual volume. Okay, so the volumes are the actual like milliliter amounts, and then the capacity is like your maximum milliliter amounts for you specifically. Okay. So in addition to that residual volume that's left over in your lungs, there's also what we call dead space, which isn't just the name of a cool video game. It's actually named, I don't know if it's named after this, but it kind of makes sense if it is. But dead space is the areas of your conducting zone of your, well, actually your upper respiratory system and the conducting zone of your lower respiratory system that contain air when you breathe in. So think about like the air from the atmosphere coming in to here. You have air from here all the way down into your bronchioles, but you're not actually absorbing gases from that air, right? It's just filling those spaces. Those are dead space. So how much you can inhale in your actual lungs is different from the amount that you actually inhale from the atmosphere, because you have air that's sitting in between the outside of your body and the actual alveolar sacs, that doesn't actually ever get to participate in the gas exchange process, right? So the anatomical dead space is the volume of the air that can fit inside of like your nasal cavity, your pharynx, your trachea, your primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, and your bronchioles. And it also should include, the total dead space also includes, besides that anatomical dead space, which is nasal cavity, trachea, pharynx, bronchi, and bronchioles, it can also include your alveolar dead space, which for some people is more than others because the alveoli are damaged. So if you have non-functional alveoli, or if the alveoli are blocked for some reason, that is alveolar dead space, and that's a separate thing. So anatomical dead space is like the space in all of the tubes leading into your lungs, and then alveolar dead space is the non-functional alveoli, however many you have, and those combined equal your total dead space. Okay, so anatomical dead space plus alveolar dead space equals total dead space. Here's another image showing these volumes and capacities. We're showing these as volumes. So it's the same thing as this, basically. But if this one feels better on your eyeballs, that's good. This one also includes dead space here. So these different, this is actually a really interesting graphic because it's showing you the dead space, which does not actually participate here. And then your residual volume, which is how much is always in the lungs. Your expiratory reserve, so how much you can breathe out before you get to that residual volume. The total tidal volume, which is how much you normally breathe. So the blue is how much you normally breathe in and out during quiet respiration. You can inhale up this much, you can exhale that much. This much stays in the lungs, and your dead space never makes it into the alveoli. All right, same thing here. Blue is that vital capacity, or that tidal volume, right? If you inhale as much as you can, if you exhale as much as you can, the amount that's always lingering inside of your lungs. Okay. So here's my little spirometry slide. Your spirometry is what we use to determine whether pulmonary disease is obstructive or restrictive. So that's two different things. An obstructive pulmonary disease means that you have increased airway resistance. So an airway will be obstructed. They may be constricted and smaller. So you have the same amount of airways, but they are smaller and causing more resistance to bringing air in. That would be called an obstructive pulmonary disease. Whereas a restrictive pulmonary disease means that you actually have a reduced lung capacity to begin with, or entirely. So it doesn't matter, or you don't necessarily have a problem inhaling or exhaling, you just can't inhale as much or exhale as much. So your capacities are generally lower than the normal person, and we call those restrictive pulmonary diseases. And the way to tell the difference between them is to use spirometry. You know you have some sort of a pulmonary disease, something's not right. Is it obstructive or restrictive? Well, you have somebody blow into this device. The computer measures the forced vital capacity. So basically you're blowing as hard as you can, as fast as you can, to find out how much you can actually exhale. And if it's not very much, then you probably have a restrictive pulmonary disease. If it's a normal amount, but you can't get 80% of that volume out within the first second, so you can't exhale very fast, then it's probably an obstructive pulmonary disease, okay? So you basically measure the forced expiratory volume. I know it's a lot. I know this is a lot of letters. I promise I won't like test you based on these little shorthands. I will test you based on the full word, the full verbiage, so that you can understand what these are. The forced expiratory volume is the volume that you can forcefully expire, right? Forcefully expire. And if you measure it within that first second of the blowing, you should be able to exhale 80% of your lung volume within that first second. If you can't, then you probably have an obstructive pulmonary disease. If you can, but that total vital capacity that you exhale is not very large, then you probably have a restrictive pulmonary disease, okay? There are videos on this, by the way, if you want to look on YouTube for some of the more clinical application stuff, go check it out. Okay, coming back to big picture, we talked about pulmonary ventilation, which is the actual pulling of air into your lungs through the upper respiratory tract and the conductive zone of the lower respiratory tract. We talked about a little bit about, so far, about external respiration, which is the gas exchange that happens between the air in the lungs and the alveoli and the blood in the capillaries that are covering the alveoli. Internal respiration, I already said, is largely, in terms of the physics of it, basically the same as external respiration, but it is the exchange of gases instead of between the air and the blood. It is now between the blood and the tissues. And then cellular respiration, again, is that is just the actual using that oxygen as that final electron acceptor in the mitochondria of your cells, right? There's your mitochondria. Okay. All right, so let's talk about external respiration. Let's talk about this process right here. We'll talk about this now. Okay. This process is also called pulmonary gas exchange. Between the air in the alveoli and the blood in the capillaries. The amount of gas that will dissolve in a liquid. So here we go, back with some chemistry and some physics here. Gases do dissolve into liquids. The reason why a soda is carbonated, what that means is that you have literally dissolved carbon dioxide into water. So the soda is basically water and sugar, and then carbon dioxide has been forced to dissolve in it in a little pressurized can. When you pop the tab and it goes tss, that is the carbon dioxide escaping out of that liquid. That's the gas leaving the liquid and going out into the atmosphere. It doesn't want to be in there. The only reason that it's in there is because it's under pressure. Once you open the tab, you're equalizing the pressure and the carbon dioxide is free to go. If you leave it sitting out, it will get flat. And all that means is that all of that carbon dioxide in that soda has left the building. It's left the can, okay? The partial pressure of that carbon dioxide in that can of soda, once you open it, is greater than the pressure of it outside of the can. So it's going to flow down its pressure gradient out of the liquid and into the atmosphere. So the partial pressure of the gas in this scenario, where you have the gas inside of the alveoli trying to get into the liquid inside of the capillaries, it works the same way. If you have a higher partial pressure of that gas inside of this matter, this gaseous matter here, if that's higher than the partial pressure of that same gas inside of the liquid of the blood in the capillaries here, then it will travel down its pressure gradient from the air in the alveolus into the liquid of the blood. Also, the solubility of gases is different, and this is more of a chemistry question, but different gases have different solubilities in water and in different substances. Oxygen is actually less soluble in liquid than carbon dioxide is. You would have to have a much thicker can and much higher pressure to dissolve oxygen into that same can of soda. Carbon dioxide is much easier to force to dissolve in water just because of the chemistry of it. And that is what we call its solubility, okay? And then finally, the temperature of the liquid. So you may notice that if you opened up a can of soda that you didn't want to drink right away and you're like, oh shoot, well, you put it in the fridge and it stays carbonated a little bit longer. If you left it on the counter, it goes flat really fast. If the liquid is warmer, then the gas that's dissolved in the liquid is like more energetic because it's warmer, right? Those molecules are moving a little bit faster. That means that they are going to want to escape a little bit more, okay? Increase in temperature generally also means an increase in pressure because the molecules are moving around a little bit faster. They're hitting each other more. That's what pressure is. And then they escape. If you slow them down by putting the soda in the fridge, they are a little bit slower, pressure is not quite as high, and they stick around for a little bit longer. So the partial pressure of that gas in one place versus the other determines how much it will dissolve. The solubility of that particular gas, that particular element, those particular elements or that particular molecule, its solubility, which is a chemistry thing. And then the temperature of the liquid is going to determine how much of that gas is going to be able to dissolve in the liquid or will stay dissolved in the liquid. And hypoxia, by the way, is a lack of oxygen going to the tissues. Okay, so hypoxia is a bad thing. We're going to talk about that in a bit. Alrighty. So like I said before, we're talking about external respiration, but this is also true for internal respiration. These basic physics things are also true for internal respiration. The partial pressure of the gas molecules in the blood need to exceed the partial pressure of that gas in the tissues in order for that gas to flow down its pressure gradient, and vice versa. All right, so here's another picture showing you pretty much the same thing. We've got the alveoli, or an alveolus here. We've got the epithelial cells that form that blood-air barrier, right, in between the air and the blood. And in between these two basically single cell thick membranes, oxygen and carbon dioxide must diffuse between the air and the liquid, the gas in the liquid, in the air in the alveolus and the blood in the liquid in the blood, respectively. Okay, so one more time, the partial pressure of oxygen needs to be greater here than it is here in order for oxygen to diffuse down its concentration and its pressure gradient into the blood, and vice versa. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide needs to be greater in the blood than it is in the alveolus in order for carbon dioxide to travel down its concentration and its pressure gradient into the alveolus so that you can exhale it. This is achieved naturally when the deoxygenated blood from the pulmonary arteries reaches the capillary bed inside of your lungs. The concentration gradient of, the partial pressure of oxygen inside of this blood is low, right? It's deoxygenated blood. So that concentration of oxygen is low there, but it's high in the alveoli. Oxygen travels into the blood. As it travels through the capillary bed, the blood becomes more highly oxygenated. And at the same time, the concentration of carbon dioxide is going to be higher in that deoxygenated blood, right? Because it's carrying waste products. It'll be high there and relatively low in the alveolus. So carbon dioxide will leave the blood and go into the alveolus. And as that blood travels through, it drops carbon dioxide and it picks up oxygen and it becomes nice, fresh, oxygenated blood and travels back to the heart to be distributed throughout the body. Okay, so physics, this is how this happens. All right, diffusion problems are what cause hypoxia. Okay, so hypoxia, again, is not enough oxygen getting to the tissues. In a normal lung, you have deoxygenated blood passing by your alveoli. The oxygen goes from the alveolus into the blood. Carbon dioxide leaves the blood and goes into the alveolus at the rate needed for you to be happy and healthy. A few different things can cause hypoxia. Emphysema, where you have your alveoli are damaged or destroyed. If the walls of the alveoli are damaged, you have less surface area for gas exchange to actually happen. So the reason why we have bunches of grape structures for the alveolar sacs is because it increases surface area, right? Lots and lots of surface area inside of each of those little balls. If you mess that up, if your little alveolar sac, the alveoli are damaged and you end up with just kind of a sac and it's not all the nice little alveoli, then you don't have as much surface area and the blood is going to get by faster than you can have diffusion. There isn't enough room. There isn't enough surface area for that diffusion to happen, for it to happen fast enough. Fibrotic lung disease, thickened alveolar membranes will make it harder for gases, these small gas molecules, to diffuse in and out of the alveoli. Pulmonary edema, if you have fluid buildup in the lungs, you will literally increase the space and the difficulty for gases to travel the distance between the inside of the alveolar sac and the capillary. You're literally putting fluid in between the capillaries and the alveolar sac that they're supposed to be right up against, which increases the distance that those gases need to diffuse to get to where they're going. So blood is going to get by without being oxygenated. And then asthma, increased airway resistance means that you're not going to have as much oxygen in the alveolus to even get into the capillary. So if you can't breathe in enough fresh air, then the concentration gradient of oxygen here will not be high enough for it to diffuse down into the blood. And so that blood will not be oxygenated. So that's 4 different ways that you can have hypoxia in external respiration. Hypoxia can occur at other levels as well, but this is an external respiration. All right, internal respiration, in short, the physics are the same. You need to have a higher partial pressure in the place you're coming from than in the place you're going to so that the gas will go in the right direction, whether that's from the blood into the tissues or from the tissues into the blood, right? This is the part we're talking about now. Yeah, okay, all right. So that's literally all I'm saying about internal respiration. It's the physics, the factors are the same, okay? Except we're talking about, instead of talking about going from air to blood, now we're talking about going from blood to tissues. But these molecules still need to travel down their concentration gradients in the correct direction, okay? The physics is the same. All right, so let's talk about oxygen transport and carbon dioxide transport, because like I said earlier, oxygen is not actually that soluble in water and blood is mostly water. Carbon dioxide is a little bit more soluble in water, but still not enough for it to just be diffusion. Nothing can ever be simple, right? It has to be more complicated than what we just explained. There's more to it. So literally only about 2% of that oxygen from the alveoli, from the air, actually diffuses through simple diffusion into the blood plasma, okay? Oxygen has a low solubility. So that's literally only 2% of the oxygen that your tissues get comes from simple diffusion from the air into the plasma of the blood. Sorry, the rest has to get there a different way. We came up with a mechanism when we evolved blood. When we became animals and evolved blood, we came up with a different mechanism. And that mechanism actually is different for different animals, but for the vast majority of animals, it's hemoglobin. We use iron. Some other animals use copper, which is kind of bizarre, and their blood is actually like a bluish green. Bet you didn't know that. But humans and most animals have red blood because we use iron, which is why we call this hemoglobin. Like hematite is a type of rock that contains iron. Hemoglobin is a polypeptide that contains iron. Back in part A, we talked about the quaternary structure of some proteins, and hemoglobin is a common example of that. So recall hemoglobin has four proteins stuck together. It has quaternary structure. It has iron atoms, which help to bind the oxygen for some reason that I don't know. That's chemistry beyond, beyond my current understanding. But it's extremely important, I know that, because about 98% of the oxygen that reaches your tissues has to get there with the help of hemoglobin, okay? So hemoglobin is the protein that is found in your red blood cells, right? So this, do I have this red blood cell right here? It contains hemoglobin. The oxygen that diffuses in and dissolves in the blood plasma is about 2%. The rest that comes in here needs to be captured by the hemoglobin in this red blood cell, okay? And it is because of chemistry that oxygen, it has an affinity for certain binding sites on hemoglobin. Once hemoglobin binds 4 oxygen molecules, because each one can bind 4 oxygen molecules, 1 for each protein, we call it oxyhemoglobin, because now it contains oxygen. Once this hemoglobin reaches a tissue and drops that oxygen off, it becomes what we call deoxyhemoglobin, and that is the main component of that deoxygenated blood that needs to go back to the heart and get to the lungs, right? To be reoxygenated, right? Here we go. So your oxygen needs to be transported by hemoglobin. When hemoglobin has oxygen attached to it, it's called oxyhemoglobin. When it detaches and drops it off to the tissues, it's called deoxyhemoglobin. And there are physics and chemistry reasons for why there's a greater affinity for oxygen at the lungs, and why the affinity for oxygen in the tissues outweighs the affinity that hemoglobin has at the tissues to allow hemoglobin to let go. And it's really important that that balance is maintained. The reason why people die of carbon monoxide poisoning is because carbon monoxide binds to these binding sites with a much stronger affinity than oxygen is able to. So it basically crowds out oxygen on the hemoglobin, which means that when the hemoglobin gets to the tissues, it won't let go of that carbon monoxide. It won't let go of that oxygen, which means that your tissues never get it, and then you die of hypoxia. So get your heater checked out. Okay, just get carbon monoxide sensors. Always have those. Carbon dioxide transport, you have a little bit more carbon dioxide that actually dissolves into the blood plasma because carbon dioxide has a slightly higher solubility than oxygen. So you have 7 to 10% about of carbon dioxide that is transported in the blood plasma that's dissolved in there. About 20% of your carbon dioxide gets transported also by hemoglobin, which is interesting to me. I feel like most people don't know that. And when hemoglobin binds with carbon dioxide, it's called carbaminohemoglobin. Carbaminohemoglobin, carbaminohemoglobin. Try and say that 5 times fast. It's harder than it sounds, which I can think is kind of funny, but it's called carbaminohemoglobin because it binds to a different place on the hemoglobin than oxygen does. It binds to the amino group or to an amino group on the hemoglobin. So that's why it's called carbaminohemoglobin when hemoglobin is binding carbon dioxide. And about 20% of your carbon dioxide that you're taking from your tissues as a waste product and bringing to the lungs and dropping off there to exhale happens with hemoglobin. The rest, the vast majority, 70%, actually gets dissolved in the blood as bicarbonate ions. So it actually kind of changes form. It reacts with hydrogen in the blood, and it hangs out there and diffuses out. It goes through a couple of chemical changes and then it diffuses out and is exhaled. This also contributes to the pH of your blood. So as we learned back in part A in the chemistry part, hydrogen ions, those little H pluses, those increase the acidity of the solution, right? So acids have these hydrogen ions floating around. Bases have bicarbonate ions floating around. And a buffer has bicarbonate ions that will basically sequester those hydrogen ions and bring the pH up. Acid has a low pH, right? Basic has a high pH. So you want to bring the pH up to avoid acidosis, which is acidification of the blood, right? Confusingly, it is carbon dioxide, excess carbon dioxide in the blood that actually will end up leading to over acidification of the blood. And that is actually the trigger for you to breathe, believe it or not, which is kind of weird. So there's a lot of chemistry stuff happening there. Just know that oxygen can be transported, dissolved in the plasma, only 2%, but carried by hemoglobin, 98%, vast majority. Carbon dioxide can be transported 3 different ways. 1, dissolved in the plasma. 2, carried on hemoglobin. And then 3, as bicarbonate ions in the blood, which also acts as a buffer in the blood to keep the pH from getting too high. I'm sorry, for getting too low. And let's talk about the actual nervous control of respiration. And then we'll talk about some diseases, and then that'll be it. So respiration is controlled by your brain stem, right? Remember this? Your pons and the medulla oblongata mainly have this reflexive control over your breathing. So you don't have to think about it. Very important. It's generally involuntary, but you can control it. So there are higher brain centers in the cerebral cortex that can override the more lizard brain reflexive respiratory control so that you can control your breathing, which is important, right? How your breathing is controlled, and what I want you to take away from this, besides that you can have voluntary control over breathing when your cerebral cortex overrides your reflexive breathing centers, which are the pons and the medulla oblongata, is that it is not a lack of oxygen that makes you want to breathe. It does not cause that reflex. Instead, it is the excess of carbon dioxide that is actually detected by chemoreceptors, which are found in various places. They're in your blood vessels and they're in your actual brain itself, okay? So chemoreceptors are autonomic sensory receptors that detect chemical differences in the environment. Your blood vessels are a good place to have chemoreceptors because within the blood vessel walls, if you have a chemoreceptor and they detect that the blood passing by is becoming too rich with carbon dioxide, it will send a signal to the pons and the medulla to reflexively breathe. To get really morbid, if you've ever drowned before, but sorry, when somebody drowns, I'm sorry if this is dark for some of you guys. If somebody drowns, you exhale reflexively under the water because you're trying to get rid of that carbon dioxide. The reason why you inhale reflexively is literally to try to get a greater concentration of oxygen in the lungs, which in turn takes over the concentration of carbon dioxide that was sitting in there, which would pull carbon dioxide out of the blood. You're trying to create the concentration gradient and the partial pressure gradient to pull carbon dioxide out of the blood. You're not trying to get oxygen. You're just trying to create the conditions that pull carbon dioxide out of the blood, which is super interesting. And like, it's just so sad and tragic. So when you like reflexively inhale and you drown, that's what your body is trying to do. It's trying to get rid of carbon dioxide, not get oxygen. Getting oxygen is of course very important, but the actual cause of the reflex is excess carbon dioxide, which I think is just really, really interesting. And I'm kind of a morbid person, so that's how I think about it. It's how I like to think about it. It's interesting. Alrighty, so this is again this this feedback loop. So basically, if your carbon dioxide concentration in the artery that has a chemoreceptor gets too high, goes up, then the pH goes down. We have acidification, acidosis of the blood. That is going to be detected by chemoreceptors in the brainstem, as well as or chemoreceptors in the arteries. So you've got aortic chemoreceptors as well as brainstem chemoreceptors that should be detecting acidification of the blood. You have an impulse then to the brain that causes the medulla oblongata, the medullary respiratory center, to activate the reflex, the involuntary reflex to inhale. You have increased ventilation, and carbon dioxide now gets to travel down its concentration gradient into the lungs, and you can exhale it. In that way, you dispose of that excess carbon dioxide, and you lower your arterial carbon dioxide concentration and increase the pH back to normal. Okay, so if you're holding your breath, the impulse is not to breathe in more because you don't have enough oxygen. The impulse, that reflex, is to exhale. You're trying to get rid of that carbon dioxide. The next inhale, bringing in fresh oxygen, is just making a partial pressure gradient in the direction for carbon dioxide to leave the blood and into the lungs so that you can exhale it. Pretty awesome. Okay, some respiratory diseases important to know. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which you can diagnose with spirometry, right? Namely, if you are able to, namely, if you are not able to forcefully exhale 80% of your lung volume within the first second of that exhale that you do into a spirometer, you can be diagnosed with obstructive pulmonary disease. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease can be caused by several different things. Continual or chronic bronchitis. So if you are constantly causing inflammation to your bronchi by exposing them to tobacco smoke or air pollution, you can end up with chronic bronchitis, which is a cause of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. If you have a breakdown of the walls of the alveoli, of those elastic fibers, or a loss of those elastic fibers, which can happen for several different reasons, but one of them is this protein deficiency. You can have what's called emphysema, which is also a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, a COPD. Okay. Asthma is an obstructive pulmonary disease, but it doesn't happen all the time, right? Asthmatics have obstructed breathing for short periods, and then the rest of the time they breathe freely and normally. So it's not technically a COPD, it's not technically an obstructive pulmonary disease, because the obstruction is reversible for asthma. TB, tuberculosis, caused by a bacterial infection, decreases lung efficacy. Lung cancer, of course, is going to decrease lung efficacy because literally the cancerous cell will divide until you end up with a tumor that's going to take up a lot of the space of the lung and take up space that would otherwise be used for gas exchange. And in addition, those cells are very, very likely to slip into the capillaries, into the bloodstream, and in that way metastasize in other parts of the body. And that happens fairly early on in the cancer process. So the trick to surviving lung cancer is to catch it early, but it's really, really hard to do because you really don't know that you have it. There's really no way to know that you have it until you start becoming symptomatic. And by that time, it is probably metastasized. So the survival rate for lung cancer is very, very low. The mortality rate for lung cancer is very, very low. And it's very, very preventable. Don't smoke. It's very preventable. Sleep apnea is another respiratory disease when the upper respiratory tract collapses. Namely, it's usually the the naso and the oropharynx that collapses when you're trying to sleep. That is like an external, an anatomical reason for that to happen. Snoring is the result of that. You can also have sleep apnea that is controlled by your midbrain. So the medulla and the pons can screw up when you're sleeping and just not regulate your involuntary breathing while you're sleeping correctly. And you can end up actually like stopping breathing for certain periods of time at night until that acidosis is detected by your chemoreceptors and your medulla is triggered to initiate respiratory reflex, right? Which happens, and then you keep breathing, but not until after you've probably woken up from that discomfort. So people with sleep apnea, they wake up multiple times a night. It's usually the biggest problem with sleep apnea is not necessarily that you're not getting the oxygen, but because it wakes you up so much that you get insufficient sleep, which affects your body in a lot of different negative ways. Sleep apnea is treated best with a CPAP machine if it's that external anatomical collapsing of the pharynx. Having a constant pressure in the airway, which is what a CPAP machine gives, holds the airway open while you sleep so that you don't have it collapse. And that is a wrap on the respiratory system. That one is super fun to me. I hope you agree that it's pretty cool. I will see you guys on Thursday to talk more about it and to do some fun activities about the respiratory system. Don't miss it. And don't forget to do your homework for this week. Of course, you're going to want to read the chapter. That's chapter 22, respiratory system. Watch these lectures. You already did that. Good job. Your homework this week is your chapter 22 homework, regular thing. And then you also have a PhysioX on respiratory mechanics. And for additional resources this week, I have your dynamic study modules, as well as a link to Complete Anatomy, which again, I recommend that you download Complete Anatomy so you have access to these models, which are the next best thing to having physical models that you can put your hands on. I made a Pinterest board for anatomy and physiology. I keep pinning to it, so go and find me if you're on Pinterest. I found this online anatomy quiz book. It's just another way to quiz yourself if you wanted to. And of course, our crash course videos on the respiratory system. Very good introductory videos explaining the respiratory system. Check all of that out, and I will see you on Thursday. Don't forget to keep up with your studying, you guys. Next week, you still have to learn about blood a little bit before the exam, so make sure that you're on top of it ahead of time. I will get you your study guide ASAP, and I will re-upload the PowerPoint right now. All right, you guys, have a great rest of your week. And again, I will see you on Thursday. Bye-bye.